Welcome to A Court of Transformation and Awakening. I am Lorrie Gray.
And I'm Amanda Grace Harrison.
And in today's episode, we are discussing Book 1, Chapter 1. Okay, friend, here we go.
Here we go.
All right, so what did you... Can you remember, like, when you first read it, what your first impression was of this chapter? Because now we've read a ton, and we're kind of, like, looking back on it and reading it with fresh eyes. But do you remember what your first thoughts were?
Question. I just remember being surprised that it was, because it starts out so, like, not romantic.
Right?
It was like, oh, okay, so, all right. This is where it's a different, not what I was expecting, but it's very, like... It's hard life in that first chapter.
Yeah. It was, I had just finished the Throne of Glass series. And so then I jumped into, or this was, I think, like a preview, like, sneak peek of new book coming out. And I read it. And I remember, like, not being impressed. I'm like, I don't know if this seems like something I'm going to like.
Yeah.
So I'm like, who is this girl? She's obviously immortal. She's, like, hunting in the woods.
Yeah. I've never hunted or wanted to hunt, so I can't relate.
Yeah, it did seem a little off. I'm so glad that I stuck with it, because that initial chapter, it didn't necessarily pull me in. But now, like, having read everything and going back and looking at it with fresh eyes, I like the way that she started it. Like you said, it's not romantic. It's not exciting right from the get-go.
But it is her ordinary world, which is
yes.
where you have to start an adventure. You can't start with the adventure. Then
Exactly.
It won't be a contrast from anything.
I love it. Okay, so going through this, so let's talk about some things that stood out to us. So right away, page 1, we're reading through, and she talks about she was focusing on her surroundings, on the task ahead, and she says that was all I could do, all I'd been able to do for years. Focus on surviving the week, the day, the hour ahead. And that, when I read that, I'm like, talk about a picture of surviving versus thriving.
Yeah. Instantly takes you to, like, first month of motherhood or being in chronic illness, and where you're just like, all I can do is survive. I don't have any energy left for anything beyond survival.
Exactly. And I think it's a reality for more people, and I don't think it's really talked about that much. And as much as there's, I love that there's more of a push towards really understanding mental illness, really understanding chronic illness. I am seeing more of it, but even then, like, people do lip service to it's okay to not be okay. But then I don't know what you've experienced, but I think so many of us, though, we actually show up and we're like, okay, I'm not okay. And then somebody jumps in with, here's a tool, here's a trick, let's fix it. We say it's okay.
Yeah. It's okay to not be okay, but let's fix it real quick.
Let's fix it really quick. Because we can, and you should, and I'm actually really uncomfortable with this.
Yes.
And I think that was why I liked this book and why I wanted to do a program with it, is because, the way we see her life in chapter 1, I mean, it's genuine, true suffering.
Yeah. And
to the point where we can't do the fluffy bypassing thing.
Yeah.
We can't be like, oh, it's not that bad, Feyre.
Chin up.
Chin up. There's a silver lining.
Yeah.
There's a purpose in this. There's a whatever.
This too shall pass.
This too shall pass. Like, let's just, like, bypass this with something fluffy. And, you can't for this. And honestly, I don't think most of us should do that as often as we do, or as often as we've been taught to.
Yeah.
I love the movie, by the way, Inside Out. I think was such a good picture of this, where it's not about, are we going to be negative or are we going to be positive? It's about, there has to be an honest going through what's really happening to get to the positive in a way that's genuine. As opposed to just, let's pass over it because we're all too uncomfortable to really talk about it. But I find so many people that I talk to actually just say it's really bad or I'm really hurting. Like, they don't feel permission to do that. And they'll justify it to me. And I'm like, no. I'm like, you don't have to do that. Let me tell you a little bit about my story and why you don't have to do that with me.
Yeah.
But I think that so many people have experienced probably what I have, where they have an honest moment, and then somebody does that bypassing thing to them. They come back, or they almost like correct them for being honest. And so what I see people do is they do it to themselves first. Like they'll just tack on like a positive at the end, so that they don't receive that from somebody else.
I definitely do that.
Do you?
How's your day? Oh, it's awful. Oh my gosh, this and that happened. But that's okay, because I get to wash dishes now, and then I'm going to feel better about my house or whatever. Like, you always have to end on a positive note.
And on a positive note. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and that's, I don't think that's bad, right? Because like, I'll tell people all the time, I'm like, I think that in any given moment, there are things that are good and positive and lovely always. And making space for that in a way that gives airtime to what we're grateful for and also what's hard, I think both are important. I think it just has to do with what that motivation is behind it and whether we're doing that in a healthy way.
Yeah.
It's been interesting. I had a conversation. This is a conversation I have often, but I did have it again recently, so it was top of mind. But I had one of my clients who deals with chronic illness. I was going to say a lot of my clients deal with chronic illness, but honestly, if you look at the country right now, how many, I forget what the statistic is. I think it's maybe 1 in 6 women end up with an autoimmune condition at this point. It's really, really high. I identify as a Spoonie, as a person with, chronic illness. And even though my case was really extreme, it's been interesting to realize that like, that's not such a rare, small group of us anymore. Yeah. It's different degrees and it's different levels to it. But that community is unfortunately getting larger and larger all the time. But I had a client, or I'll have clients like this, where they're experiencing symptoms, like they're not feeling great. But then they have this self-gaslighting thing that happens, or downplaying, or trying to be positive, or trying to be strong, whatever version of that you want to go with. And so what they say is, oh, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. I'm okay.
Yeah.
And something about that feels right to them. But what I'll point out to them, I'm like, okay, if you say it's not that bad, then what kind of action do you take? And the truth is, it's none. It's pushing down, it's pushing through. And what ends up happening is this thing where they're like, it's not that bad. It becomes that bad because they're not actually addressing the symptoms. But something about saying it's not that bad feels right. And we just walk through. I'm like, let's just look at what happens when that's your thought. What does that actually lead to for you? And what does that create for you? And what ends up happening is it makes it worse. Where oddly enough, if we look at our life and we can say, oh no, it's that bad. It's actually really bad. In a way that is action oriented, it moves people towards taking action and making change. And by owning it is that bad, it actually opens up space to make it better. And it does it's one of those paradoxes. It's one of those things where what people assume works one way, it's actually the opposite of what they think. But whenever we look at something, we're like, no, it actually really is that bad. Then we're like, then let's fix it. Then let's change it. Then what happens? And my clients who, when they actually own that their symptoms are that bad, they seek help, they look for answers, they advocate to doctors, they do what they need to because they're owning it's that bad. And they end up getting to a place where they get the help that they need. So this whole like false positivity thing, I'm so against. I'm not against honest positivity.
Right.
I'm not against the real stuff. Just the
harmful positivity.
Just there we go. There's one. But the part that tells us we need to bypass our pain or bypass our humanity or downplay our experience to make somebody else more comfortable.
Yeah.
And so I like chapter 1 because I think that we're, as readers, invited into a space where we're allowed to admit sometimes life is hard.
Yeah, it's winter.
It's winter. What did she say? It's the hard times. It's winter.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of my big flags, was like, it's the very closing line. It's an awkward time to say it since we're not at the end of the video, but this was the forest and it was winter. You know, it's like, that's like that, and it is hard. That's just bad. When you're in the forest and it's winter, there's no glossing over that and going like, oh, it's not so bad. No, it really is. Everything is gone. There's no plant life anywhere. Everything is frozen. The animals have all gone somewhere else. It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and so sort of, see, I told you were going to bring in all the great metaphors. So like for us, like it's okay to own, like if we're in a winter season.
Yes. And we all have winter seasons. We have a winter every month as women. We'll get into that later.
We do. We will definitely talk about that. Yeah, so I love, anyway, so that was one of the things that really stood out for me for this chapter, and one of the things that I liked about doing this as a group. Okay, so other part though that really stood out to me, and I think you and I, when I looked at our notes, I'm like, what? I'm like, where were your book tabs? I think we put one in the same place on page 3,
Yes.
where we get the first glimpse of sort of her dreams and how she
way of seeing
functions,
the world
how
as
she
an
sees the
artist.
world. Yes,
Is that what you're talking about?
I am. Yeah, where she says, you know, once it had been second nature to savor the contrast of new grass against dark tilled soil, or an amethyst brooch nestled in folds of emerald silk. By the way, I'm so bad at reading aloud. Are you better at reading aloud?
No, I love reading out loud.
Will you read it out loud?
Yes,
You read
I'll
this whole
read it.
passage to us. I don't like it. It makes me so uncomfortable.
Starting with the emerald silk.
Well, you can just start at the beginning of or wherever.
Okay, once it had been second nature to savor the contrast of new grass against dark tilled soil, or an amethyst brooch? It's definitely not brooch. It's definitely brooch. Nestled in. I'm so good at reading out loud, especially when I mispronounce things. Or an amethyst brooch nestled in folds of emerald silk. Once I dreamed and breathed and thought in color and light and shape. Sometimes I'd even indulge in envisioning a day when my sisters were married and it was only me and father, with enough food to go around, enough money to buy some paint, and enough time to put those colors and shapes down on paper or canvas on the cottage walls. Oh, or the cottage walls. Or the cottage walls. Should we stop there?
No, that's so good. Yeah, and then the next, but the end of the next
Yeah,
next one where she's like, I couldn't remember the last time I'd done it. Like
bothered
Yep.
to notice anything lovely or interesting. And that's what I thought was so impressive about this, because she's like, she has this involuntary self-care mechanism that took over in that moment. Like, she's just hunting. She's trying to get more comfortable in the tree where she's been crouched for all these hours trying to catch something. And she says, despite myself, despite my numb limbs, I quieted that relentless, vicious part of my mind to take in the snow-veiled woods. And that's when she notices all the colors and all of that. But like, despite her, like, she does not want to take this self-care moment where the artist in her gets to come out and see all the beauty. But despite herself, that's just in her. The artist wants to come out and it's like, no, just stop for a second and see all this.
Right?
It's magic all around you.
When you see, I mean, you know, not to jump too far ahead for people who haven't read it, but she doesn't value this part of her.
No.
And I think that whenever I look at book 1, there's a lot of themes in book 1. There's a lot of things that come out. But for me, her journey and her relationship to her art is one of the things I find the most interesting. Now, yeah, I'm not an artist, but just the idea of like what we're passionate about and what our like calling and purposes in the world, that not everybody embraces it fully. Not everybody sees it as positive. And, you know, from the get-go, we see that she doesn't necessarily have this beautiful, positive relationship with her dream. You know, people talk about dreams and goals like they're all beautiful and positive. Oh, I have this dream and this hobby and this thing that I'm going to do. She has this beautiful gift inside of her, and she doesn't value it.
No, she hates it.
Yeah.
Because it's not, because she's in survival mode, and this thing takes her out of that, and it puts her in this, and she's like, I don't want to dream about these beautiful things that aren't happening right now. Right now I need to kill something to feed my family.
Exactly.
I don't have time for this.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not accessible right now. And so it feels like a distraction from surviving.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, talk about deep. I mean, how many of us is that the case? And that's why this idea of like quieting this relentless, vicious part of my mind.
Because she says, not likely to happen anytime soon, perhaps ever.
Right. Gosh, I mean, and again, I'm not in the woods starving, but I do, like, I so related to this idea of like a mind that just feels like it's constantly going, right? And it's constantly, my brain so easily gets in scarcity. And it's not even about, like, I can look at things in my life and know that factually that's not necessary. And my brain still goes there. And there are times whenever I have trouble quieting my mind. But I love that she talks here about there is a measure of choice in it. Like where she had to make a choice to let that be quieted so then she could go and she could have this moment with herself and allow it. But anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, except that I relate to a mind that doesn't necessarily let us rest. And I think, I remember I was going with it. Like the idea of mindfulness, right? Like being present. I think that in a similar way to her, like I believe this lie of like, that's not as valuable as going and just getting stuff done, right? Especially when you're in scarcity, when you're in survival. It's like, no, I just have to go. I have to get more done. Go, 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 go. And the idea of like, stop and smell the roses, which by the way, in a very literal sense, I've genuinely stopped and be like, oh, there's a flower. I'm going to actually stop and enjoy the flower and smell it. I'm like, there's a literal aspect to stop and smell the roses, but it's so easy for me to tell myself like, that's not relevant. That's not important. Here's all these important things that I have to go, do. And choosing to allow myself to stop and fully be in a present moment, and or to train my brain to actually be present enough for me to allow myself to have that moment. It's hard to do when you're struggling. So I don't know where everybody else is at, but I can just relate to where she's at right now. I'm thankful that like I'm not in that horrific survival mode right now, but I just remember times when I really was.
Yeah.
All right, friend. Any other thoughts on this chapter?
This chapter, what is this? Oh, yeah, page 5, where you find out that from infancy, they've been sung lullabies about how evil the fairies are and how to kill them. That was interesting, because that's sort of one thing you can sing lullabies about.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, talk about the world that she's raised in. And we see a little bit more about, we learn a little bit more about her world and a little bit about the history and things in the next chapter. But yeah, I guess, what did I say? So I think the part that I take from that is, yeah, she's not thriving right now. She is kind of surviving, but it's not 100% because she's like, yeah, that's the path that I chose for myself. She was born into this place where things are really difficult and things are really hard. And so much of the mindset, so much of the thought patterns, so much of those things were handed down to her. She was born into a world of fear and hate. And while this is a really, dramatized version of that, I think I can relate to that a little bit as well.
I didn't think about it until you just said that. I'm like, oh crap, I was totally sung lullabies about how evil some people in the world are. It just didn't come out as a lullaby, but it was in my milk from the moment I was born. You're taught those things of who's evil and who you're allowed to hang out with and who's good for you and who should burn in hell.
Do you watch Stranger Things?
I have watched a few episodes of Stranger
Things. Okay, are you watching? Okay, so
only watched the first season.
I can't give anything away. Oh my gosh. Okay, so the new season just dropped. And so we're only, I think, 2 episodes in, which by the way, I have to say, this new season, it's almost too scary for me. Like the other ones were bordering on it. Like I watched the first episode, I'm like, This one's more like horror.
I thought the first season was like horror. I can't do anything that's even like a little bit horrific.
Oh my gosh. No. Okay.
Especially
So
because I have little kids.
season 1's scary, but like this one is like straight up horror film where I'm like, I don't know if I can watch this.
Yeah,
like,
no, I know for sure I can't.
End of episode 1, we were all actually screaming, out loud. Okay, my husband didn't scream. He would be really upset. So my eldest daughter chose to laugh really loud because she was trying to get out of it. My husband just had like a shocked face. Me and my youngest were actually screaming out loud because it was so scary. But the point with that is in some of the other episodes and this one, there's this ongoing theme of the Dungeons and Dragons game being evil.
So evil. If you even talk about it or touch it, you'll die within 3 days. I think I was told something like that as a very young child.
And I remember when Harry Potter came out, right? And it was like, there are real spells.
Yes.
It's actually satanic.
Yes.
It's totally horrible. And I believed that because it was said by people in authority. And it wasn't until I was much older and I found other adults who I respected. They're like, they're great books. I was like, are they? Okay. And I went through.
Allowed to read them though?
And then I thought it was really, really interesting to find that one of the themes throughout those entire books is like prejudice.
Yes. It's hilarious. Hilarious and true. But there is some truth. And I don't know how much truth there is in what I was taught growing up. Whereas there are some fairies who are like to be avoided for sure. Like obviously I won't mention who. I was about to say it. That would be a major spoiler, seeing as we're still in book 1, chapter 1. Thinking of some people, I'm like, they definitely do need to make some lullabies about how awful these creatures, people, they persons, whatever they are.
Yeah, so some of what they were told
truth.
Was legit for sure.
It was just the generalization of all fairies are evil, which is same thing.
Yeah,
all non-us are evil. Not
yes, Exactly. But it was one of those things where I think whenever I got older and I looked back on some of that stuff, there was a period of time whenever I had judgments of myself, and I'm almost like, I feel like I should have seen that. Like, that's really clear now. Oh, that's really obvious. And it just, the thing that I will tell people and the thing I have to remind myself of all the time is I'm like, it does not make sense to beat myself up for something that I didn't know in the past. No. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And I think we all do it. But the more that I move to being able to compassionately understand how I developed the mindsets and the patterns that I did from, not judgment, just from compassion, like the more I understand it and the more I'm able to look at it and be like, oh, that makes sense. I was a kid. I was being told this by people in authority and people that I had trusted. So of course I believed it. And to be able to just understand where it came from and to be compassionate with myself and not add on extra judgment to all of it, and to be able to just let it go and move on and learn from it is really helpful. But yeah, so and this is good for our character Feyre, because there are going to be times when we're like, girl, really? Because we're standing on the outside of it, right? Yep. We're on the outside looking at it, and for us it's all super clear, and for her it's not. But the author does such a great job of setting this up, I think, for all of her characters, where sometimes we see them take action where from the outside we're like, that's illogical, or that doesn't make sense, or this thing would be so much different. But she helps us see where she came from, like what beliefs, what mindsets, how she got to the headspace that she was in. And from there, I think her choices typically, I'm not going to say make sense. I'm not going to say that, but kind of. But
they're on brand for Feyre, though.
There we go. On brand. That's a way of saying it. That's very LA. Thanks, friend.
No problem.
They make sense. They make sense. Okay. All right. Well, so here we've got chapter 1, book 1. Got a character. She's surviving. She's struggling. She's barely surviving day to day, barely getting through. very little hope for the future.
And has now murdered a wolf. Is it a wolf?
Is it a
fairy?
wolf?
We don't know yet, but she cannot bring herself to feel any remorse for the dead thing. Because this was the forest and it was winter. Bless her.
Bless her. All right, friends. Well, thanks for joining us for
A Court
Chapter
of
1.
Oh, yes. Let me just say, A Court of Transformation Awakening right over you. That's your nice closing.
No, you do the official outro.
Well, thank you for joining us today, guys. And if you haven't already, be sure to join our free community at ACOTA, that's ACOTAA.circle.so, where you can jump into the fan chats. You can watch these videos there. And then you can also dive into the deeper experience, either of one of our workshops or the deeper small group adventures. Have a great week, guys.
All right, bye.